So I've been thinking for the past couple of days about the malleability of personhood, because in the past I've held that there really is no such thing as me, that we're infinitely malleable. To kind of paint the landscape as to what the limits are of personhood. If we say that people are infinitely malleable, that means that there really isn't any, at least individual personhood. That personhood is a general, almost like a dimension or a field, rather than it being individualized. If we go the opposite route and say that there is zero malleability, that there is only who I am and then who I pretend to be, then that's much closer to the idea that most people have of themselves, at least in the Western world, is that we tend to lean closer to zero malleability, meaning that every single person is absolutely unique, that every single person has an absolute core value, that there is an absolute personality structure that they have that has never changed and will never change. That's very Western. In the Eastern views of the world, it's far closer to infinite malleability, where there really isn't so much in the way of there being an individual person. It's just where you happen to find yourself in that moment. And so it's being true to yourself in that sense, in the sense of there still being infinite malleability, but you're still going to try to be true to yourself, who is yourself, in a landscape in which every individual is infinitely malleable and therefore interchangeable with every other individual. What does that really then mean to be true to yourself? And then, you actually really end up running into this idea of more like ego death and transcendence of self and release from the bondage of selfhood. Sort of like, especially in art, and I love that art style, that old ancient Chinese art style where they put the person in the background and nature is in the foreground, so that people are just like a tree or a rock or a waterfall or a bird, and then there's a human, and it's all one image. It's the person, the human, is in the background, is in the same dimension or the same level in the painting as a tree or a bird, as a part of nature, rather than being somehow separate and isolated from it. And in the West, we're more about isolating ourselves from nature, conquering nature, imposing our will upon nature, and doing so as individuals, not as a collective, as an extremely unique individual person that has an unchangeable quality about them that we call the personality. And in the West, I think culturally most of us talk about that as the soul, what my soul is, because my soul is timeless. My soul doesn't ever change. It was there at the beginning of creation. It will be there at the end. And the only one that exists beyond that, the Alpha and the Omega themselves, is God. So Alpha and Omega being the beginning, absolute beginning of time, and the absolute end of time. So there's a space there where the absolute beginning of time, the Alpha, that's all there is. And then immediately adjacent to that, there's everything else. Just immediately after that, because you can't have a multiplicity of things that all spontaneously emerge with individuality intact at the beginning. You have to have a general creator who creates all things first, or cause, whatever you want to call it, the first cause, has to stand alone. There can't be a multiplicity of first causes. There has to be one first cause. If there's a multiplicity of first causes, then we're basically saying that we don't believe in causation. Because at that point, if you were to try to derive what the cause of any given effect is, then you would only inevitably run into that multiplicity. And then how are you going to tell one of those from the other? How are you going to do a calculus on the amount of influence that each of those causes has in relation to or in a ratio with the others in that multiplicity? And how many multiples would there be? Well, if there's more than two, then it becomes impossible to reduce. So that there isn't any such thing as causation, if that's true. I believe in causation, so I don't think that there's this multiplicity at the beginning. There's just one. So that's obviously very individualistic. Not much in the way of malleability there. So we have an unchangeable, timeless God that ostensibly has an equally timeless and changeless personality structure and individual nature. And then after that, we have everything else, the origin of all of the other things, the origin, the birth, the emergence, whatever, the creation or actualization of all other things would happen immediately after the absolute beginning. And that begs the question, do each of those multiplicities retain that level of intrinsic inertia that God has, where it never changes for them? Their soul is always the same soul, and then it just changes its, let's say, location, maybe swaps places with another soul, but doesn't ever become that other soul. And that's the question. Does the movement of a soul also mean the replacement of that soul or the changing of the nature of that soul? And it's a chicken before the egg question. It's like, did the intrinsic, unchanging nature of the person cause themselves to change some other changeable aspect of their personality? Or did it just look like that and there's just simply an appearance of change, but in reality that change is just a deviation from that absolute value of the subject, of that subjective nature of that person? So, or is it something in between? Is there both going on at the same time, and it's just a question of how much, which would be the third way of answering that. Is there infinite malleability and zero personhood as far as individuality? Is there infinite malleability and therefore zero individuality for each soul, where we're not really ourselves, we are simply a part of everything else? Or is it closer to the truth to say that we have zero malleability and that any change that we declare has happened is at best superficial and at worst a lie, an error, a betrayal of oneself? You see, the difference is so huge, it couldn't be any huger. It's a question of, if I change myself, am I lying to myself? Am I betraying myself? Is that just who I am? Or in order to to change do I then come to the realization that I never really was there to begin with, that my self is just a bundle of habits and possibly just errors and deviations from nature, rather than on the opposite side of the spectrum when I say that when I change, I'm betraying my own nature as an individual. From the opposite perspective, saying that there's infinite malleability and zero individuality, any change would then therefore be a good thing and is just a way of showing that I was lying to nature. But now that I have allowed myself to change, then I can more deeply embed myself in nature and release my grasping of this particular part and rejoin the whole and basically fall into the painting, be embedded in the painting rather than superimposed on top of it artificially. And those are the questions. Is it, to be a true person, does that then mean to be true to nature and personhood? Or is it to be true to my individual self, unique from any other person? And the way that that gets answered is what is in the foreground and what is in the background, and are they the same? As an individual, am I artificially superimposed on top of nature, or as an individual, is nature superimposed on top of me? And then I have to grapple with the natural world, the world that exists outside of myself that I can't immediately and directly control. Is that superimposing itself on top of me, or am I superimposing myself on top of it? And that's the same question. There's so many answers in this, all tied together when we ask these questions, because they're an entire way of looking at the world. And I don't think that it's a solid, static answer of it's always this and it's always that. I think it depends on where you're standing. I think there's levels. So it's like at the deepest core of my soul, I would think would be the most general, because it's my tie-in, it's my root to nature. That's how I embed myself and root myself here. That's why I exist here. Even though I'm not only the here and now, I exist in the here and now, embedded within it, rooted in it. And the root of it is at the very core of my soul. That's the most general part of my soul. I then become more and more specific and individualized as I move from the absolute core of my soul to its periphery. Because just like with a sphere, if I go to the absolute center, there is no spin there. There's no movement there. There's no change there. It's just, in fact, if I were to go to the absolute center of a sphere, it wouldn't even be a point, depending on how resolute I am. If I have really, really high resolution, there won't even be room for a point at the absolute center of that sphere. And what we would measure as the discernible or observable center of the sphere is actually much larger than that absolute center, because it has to extend into space for me to be able to see it, and thus occupy at least the space of one point. That point then sits around a hollowness. And so that, I believe, is the structure of my soul. Now, as we move beyond that absolute center to that point, there is a space in between those two. And it's non-zero, because a point is non-zero. It occupies the limit of 1 as it approaches 0, which is equivalent to 1 divided by infinity, which is not equivalent to 0, but very, very close to it. It's the closest value to zero that there is, but it is not discernible. And so then therefore it isn't the number one. The number one is discernible. And so the number one is the smallest discernible unit away from zero. But the limit of zero is the smallest unit away from zero. It just isn't discernible. It isn't a static value. It's a function. The result of which is the shortest possible distance that there could ever be. But the weird thing about that distance is it's shrinking. It's not static. It's like the number one doesn't shrink. It just stays the number one. This number shrinks. So it's a fluid, moving number. It's not actually a static value. And when you look at that I think is the same representation of what happens when we move from the outside of the absolute center. If we move any distance outside of it, then we will see that fluid number shrinking, getting ever closer to that absolute center, but never quite reaching it. And that is what's happening all the time as we unzip the zipper of time. Or zip up. I guess I should say zip up the zipper of time, excuse me. Because as we move forward in time, things converge and then they stay static because the past doesn't change. The future does. The future is fluid. It changes all the time. But the past never changes. So it's like a zipper. It's taking the divergent possibilities and it's converging them at some central place. And then after that convergence, it just stays a crystal static structure. So what we are is we are the movement, or at least we are moving rather than static. So if we are moving rather than static, then the answers to those questions become even more difficult to answer from the view that we had. So now we have to change our view. It isn't that we should try to render ourselves in a static environment where we say, this is who I am, irregardless. This is who you are, irregardless. Doesn't matter. I could pick you up and put you on Pluto, and it's the same thing. And that's not the case. It is not the case that if you were to take someone and you were to put them in some totally different environment, that they would somehow retain every single aspect of their being. Of course they would change. The air they're breathing would change. The food that they're eating would change. The water that they drink would change. The culture around them would change. The climate around them would change. The diet that they have, like I said, all of that stuff will change. That person will then be changed. Whether it's a tiny little iota or a massive personality overhaul, it's going to change. The question is just how much is it going to change? How much resistance to environmental changes should we have? So, what is considered then to be a betrayal of the spirit or a stubborn, beetle-headed, ignorant arrogance? How do you really reconcile that? Well, like I said, with math being applied to the soul, if the absolute center of our soul is the most general, and then immediately after that we get slightly more specific, and we get more and more and more specific as we move further and further out, then the question is, at what point do I interact with other people in my environment? Well, that's at the periphery. That's at the most specific part of who I am, which makes perfect sense because when I'm trying to figure out what I should do in a given situation, I want to be true to myself and not deviate from myself. So I'm going to have a very specific style that no one else has. It's just me. And I can recognize it and other people can recognize it and say, yeah, that's Mike. That's who he is. That's how he does whatever it is. And everybody has their own. And so you have this super ultra specific style that is you, which is your individuality. But that part of you only exists on the surface. It only exists at the periphery. It only exists at the contact point between yourself and the environment. That's as far away from who you really are as you could get without looking at someone else. That is surface area you, which is weird because it doesn't intuitively feel like that. It intuitively feels like I'm actually rooting into who I am as a person deep in me, not at the surface, skin level deep. But that's what that is. My own individual personal style is at the periphery, at the contact point between me and the environment. The surface area of who I am is that specific style that I have, my individuality. So my individuality is the most superficial thing about me, which is weird when you think about that. That's what the structure of what I'm describing is saying. So that I do have an individuality, but my individuality, my individual nature is surface deep. It's just how other people interact with me and how I interact with other people. But as to who I am in and of myself, that's as far away from me as you can get. Who I really am is the more general part of who a person is, right? And there's a particular location that my center occupies, which I think is being true to my domain, I guess you would say. And there again, we find where is that center located, because I'm not isolated. I'm in an environment. So after I move beyond my own soul, where is that center located relative to my environment? And that is who I am. Ultimately, who I am is then an extension of not my own personality, not someone else's personality, but actually a domain or an absolute value, an absolute approach to existence. So who I am is an extension ultimately of three absolute, if you want to say, personality structures or archetypes. So I am an extension or an animation or a realization of an archetype, and I am possessed by it, and I serve it, and it is my master, and I am its slave. And I do everything that I do in accordance with it, because it's the thing that's telling me what is valuable and what is not valuable, what is to be paid attention to, and what is to be disregarded. Where are we headed and where have we been? That's what my master tells me. And everyone has one. And there's three of them. And it depends on which one that you're serving to tell you who you really are. Ultimately, if you wanted an answer as to, well, who am I? Well, I am an extension. I am a manifestation of an idea, of one of these three absolute values or absolute personalities or absolute ideas. And I am in service to this idea. I do its bidding. It tells me what is valuable and what isn't valuable. And I do for it what it could not do in and of itself, but can, through me, accomplish its goals. So that is who I am ultimately. And then I just have to figure out which of the three that I am. So there's three. There's one that represents nothing, which is at the absolute core center of reality, is nothing. Like I was saying about the center of the sphere is not even a point. It is nothing. So at the very center of reality, there is nothing. That's the first of three absolute values that I can serve. And I can serve that value if I want to. And I can say with all validity, although a hell of a lot of pushback, I would imagine, that nothing is what we should be relating to every time we want to evaluate whatever is happening around us. And that's not necessarily evil or good. It's just a way of looking at the world. It's a way of saying if that didn't exist, what would the world look like? It's like gene knockout. You can then figure out what that thing does by removing it and then putting it back in, and removing it and putting it back in. And you see the change and you see the pattern of difference from when it's there and then when it's not there. And by that, you'll know what it is and what it does. It's reductive. It's always trying to isolate what something is at its in and of itself. It's very idealistic, therefore. There's an idealism in there. I would say that there's even an anti-realism inherent to it. And that renders with it a very mystical flavor that a lot of people really don't like, especially people that are on the opposite side, that like concrete, that are more on the side of being, of existing, of manifesting, of doing. That's very, more on the Western side of it being ultra individualistic and all of that. And that's where I think most Western culture people, most of us are at that level, at the very concrete, pragmatic, practical, being, doing, acting, seeing, kind of thing, individual, unique, interactive part of reality. Whereas me, I don't usually go over there. I can, and that's who I am over there, but I can also go back to where I usually stay, which is at the very least not there. So I've described nothing being very mystical, very abstract, and I would say there's a purity with it. As far as like there's a reductive part to it too, that it reduces things to an absolute value, a pure value, value that is not diluted, that is not messy, that is not complex, that's raw and fundamental. That's more on the side of nothing. And there are people that serve that are more interested in that collectivized, generalized, abstract, mystical kind of a view. So, and then the third one would be in relation to indiscernibility. In which case, if I serve then it's neither concrete and pragmatic like being, and nor mystical and abstract like nothing. It's somewhere else. So it's more like if I was going to serve and that was the master that I served, and that then ultimately is who I am, then I would I don't know, I guess see the moderation and everything. The fact that we'll never really know anything for certain. That it's almost comical. Everything basically can be looked at in terms of it being a comedy of errors. It's just like, well, you're not, whose line is it anyway? No one really knows what's going on here. That kind of a thing. So it's not exactly doubt. It's a playful kind of look at things. It's not taking it so seriously. But maybe closer to what Alan Watts described as wiggliness to reality. Man, that one's difficult. I'm trying to say what it would be, but that one I don't know yet. I'll have to come back and try that one again later. I didn't get right. The other two, though, I like. I think those are pretty solid. The serving of nothing and the serving of being, and that's ultimately who we are, is who we serve. Our master is who we are. That's who we represent anyway. So